Hey there. For this video, I'd like to talk about guns, specifically guns in the United States. And if you're not from the United States or not tapped into the whole gun scene, whatever that means, the number of guns in the United States is large. We have more guns than we have people, and that's not counting guns in the military, that's just civilian guns. And if that seems like a crazy number to you, it's it's a lot of guns. Um, but it's not the Wild Wild West. There's a lot of laws that restrict their usage and what you can do with them. But the problem, and the problem I kind of want to cut through or tease through here, is you have two sides. You have the side that really wants to ban all the guns, and then you have the other side that wants everyone to have all the guns. And those two sides they've become entrenched. They've become uncompromising. They've become unwilling to, see beyond those two agendas. And we're winding up with a bunch of not particularly useful and often uh, laws that are just meant to antagonize each other. And I'd like to tease through a lot of that and see if we can come to some, spectrum of choices that make a lot of sense rather than this sort of black and white mentality they've been going at each other with for a while. So where I'd like to get started is there's this uh, conception on both sides that we're right and we need to change the laws to match our worldview. And alternatingly, one side gets more power than the other, and the laws get changed. Either things get banned or things get unbanned, and back and forth, back and forth. And the first thing I want to propose is that that's kind of crazy. The United States is a huge country. Things are very different in very different places. The laws that should apply really need to be specific for the area they are apply to. So let me give two examples that maybe will make my point. Imagine you're in the city. You have a young lady that just graduated college. She has a nice apartment in a nice neighborhood. She's on the second floor. There's her favorite restaurants downstairs on the corner. Grocery store around the block. She takes the metro to go to work. She lives in a very interconnected reality where the people around her are important for her survival and presumably vice versa. And her perception of guns, in fact, she probably has never seen a gun except for maybe on the hip of a police officer or on a TV show or a movie where it was a big black military style rifle that's really scary. Maybe she was mugged, or a better story, friendlier story. Maybe her friend was mugged by gunpoint, and that's pretty scary. So her worldview is these guns aren't really necessary. I mean, if she were to imagine these guns being part of her life, imagine one of her friends or some random person being given a gun that doesn't really know what they're doing, trying to make something better, like stop a robbery or whatnot, and trying to shoot the robber, missing and hitting someone else, or hitting a crowd, or it sounds like a recipe for disaster. Or you have 100 protesters on the street and they half of them have guns or whatever percentage. That sounds like a pretty disastrous situation, especially if they're all not trained. And then go to the next level. Imagine having a rifle. A rifle has a much more powerful round usually. It could fire a lot farther. It goes through things and hits things after it goes through them that you didn't intend, like going through drywall and hitting a person, or going through a window of a house. It just doesn't look good. I mean, there is maybe one slice where it looks okay, is if the person is well trained and they're in a situation where there's not a lot of people around. Maybe they're trying to get home and they took a shortcut through an alley and someone's going to try to mug them. Okay, that's starting to turn into a positive situation, or it's not a positive situation, but having that gun might make it a more positive situation, give them a better chance of, not getting killed or mugged or whatever might be the case. So this person's worldview, and this is the worldview that a lot of people have in densely packed areas, the cities. Um, it, the, it just makes a lot less sense, especially for the high power guns, but even for the low power guns, and even with some training. So let's take that context and let's flip it. Let's go out in the middle of nowhere. Let's go out into Montana. Let's say we have a middle-aged guy who's living off the land. He's a hunter, and almost by definition, you need a gun to be a hunter. I mean, I guess you could use a bow and arrow. It's less efficient and more likely to cause the animal pain and suffering. Uh, so, but maybe you don't believe in hunting and you think hunters should go away, and that's one of the prices of getting rid of guns. So consider if he's a farmer and maybe he has cattle and the winter is coming, and with the winter come the wolves, and the wolves will just slaughter his cattle unless he can fend them off with a weapon. If he doesn't have a gun, he can't put food on the table, or he maybe falls into financial ruin. He can't have farmers out there in the middle of nowhere, or maybe he's not a farmer. Maybe he just likes living out in the middle of nowhere. The closest town is maybe 30 minutes away. The closest city with a cop is maybe a couple hours. He has no effective police response time. So if someone comes to rob him or even worse, kill him, they, unless he has people visiting him all the time, they're not even going to find his body for weeks or months later. So this person has a very different context than the lady in the city. Um, it makes sense that the laws in those two different, very different worlds should be different. So her world is one of interconnectedness, and his world is one of self-reliance. This is probably one of the really distinguishing factors between the rural life and the city life. So the thing that makes the application of the laws different really comes down to one thing, and it's population density. When you have a really high population density, the laws probably need to be a little different than when you have a really low population density. And so we can frame this discussion about, the spectrum that we talked about before about what a reasonable set of laws would be. In that context, we can say, well, okay, so in the city, we probably want different laws than we have out in the countryside. And that, to no surprise, that's pretty much how it is to some degree with a bunch of craziness in the United States currently. The cities tend to have more restrictive laws, and the rural areas tend to have more permissive. So let's take a look at both ends of that spectrum and see, or both ends of that uh, sort of population density scale and see what spectrum makes sense. So if you take that one guy out in the middle of nowhere, what sort of laws do you need for that person? Pretty much nothing. He can't hurt anybody because he's the only one out there except for himself. And really, the only rules that you want in place are when you just want to make sure that he can't acquire something that is super dangerous to be shipped or moved or carried or sold somewhere else into the United States. And there's a couple of those items, one of which is probably armor piercing bullets, another is probably perfect silencers. Um, although there's a really good example right there of a way for uh, allowing more permissive laws to de-antagonize the conversation between anti-gun and pro-gun people. Allowing so if you've ever shot a gun, they can be really loud, and they do. This is a little bit of an aside. We'll get back to where I was on the spectrum a second ago. When you shoot a gun, they can be really loud and they can do a lot of damage to your hearing. And it's why you see a lot of people at the range wear those earmuffs over their ears, or why you see a lot of hunters wear those. And that's really a pretty bad idea that the person who has a gun can't hear the people around him. It, that sounds horrible, especially out in the woods where you're trying to hunt a deer. Maybe there's other hunters out there, or maybe you're just trying to hear where the animal is. It makes it really hard to hunt. So a really nice sort of bone to give to the pro-gun people would say allow silencers, but not silencers that fully silence the gun, because that's primarily how police hear where a gun is. A lot of cities even have sensor networks that can, listen for what a gun sounding sound is and then triangulate on it and show pretty accurately where that shooter is. It's where, if there's something going really sideways at an event and somebody's shooting it up, you know which way to run from. So fully silencing a gun is a terrible idea. But silencing it enough so you don't destroy pro-gun people's hearing would be a great bone to throw their way. All right, so anyway, back to the two sides. You completely rural, pretty much no laws except for you want to ban a couple of things like armor piercing and full perfect silencers. On the other end of the spectrum, we have you're in the middle of the city. So what does it make sense in the city? Well, rifles don't make much sense. They're just so deadly for the reasons we talked about before. Now, storing them and having them in your home, sure, that's probably okay because you might go out on the weekends to a rural area to go hunting or target practicing or whatever it is you do with your rifle. Using it for home defense is a terrible idea, just for all the reasons we talked about before about shooting through walls and whatnot. Same thing is true with shotguns. Shotguns have a wide spread. You walk out in the street, you fire a shotgun, you can hurt a lot of people. About the only thing that makes any sense in the city is a handgun. And specifically, not a handgun that shoots really high powered rounds, which are generally not banned, and they probably should be. If you're firing anything like a 5.62 or 5.56, 7.62 rounds, that's too big of a round to be shooting in the city, whether it's from a handgun or a rifle. So in the city, you pretty much don't want anyone carrying around a gun unless they've been trained and they know what they're doing, which means requiring coursework and requiring range time and stuff like that. And you might, and so I would say that's where the baseline is for this. You don't want any laws that are more permissive than that. Now, you might want to get more restrictive. You might just want to ban people carrying around guns. You might run afoul of the Constitution with that, but the Supreme Court actually hasn't come down on that yet. So somewhere between those 2 points seems like the reasonable place to land when you're in the city. Whereas somewhere between, just getting rid of a couple items that you don't want leaking into the general populace and no rules is pretty much what you want out in the middle of nowhere. So in this next segment, I want to talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions that the anti-gun and the pro-gun people have, and how it's hurting the conversation. So first up is this term assault weapons. So it's an ill-defined term, and a lot of people throw it around to mean many different things. The United States Army has a specific definition for it. The state of California has a very convoluted flowchart that describes what they are, which is not even close to agreement with what the Army thinks it is. Uh, People sell weapons under the name assault weapons, which don't match up with either of those sometimes. It's a pretty useless terminology at the moment. And it's a distraction. And that's the problem, is that there are many guns that are far more deadly and dangerous than a quote-unquote assault weapon, which are being sold. For example, high-powered hunting rifles. You have rifles out there that shoot 308 rounds that are designed to kill bears and elk. Those rifles are far more dangerous, at least for a single shot, and some of them have larger magazines, than quote-unquote an assault weapon. And an assault weapon is essentially just a term for something that looks all military and scary. So you wind up banning stuff that makes you feel better, but you're not actually banning the stuff that makes you safer. So that's one thing I'd like to point out. And really all that matters is how much energy over time and how that energy is distributed. So if I can shoot 1,000 rounds in a second, that's a lot of energy being shot out. But if I can only shoot 5 rounds in a second, and even though they're bigger rounds, that's a lot less dangerous than another gun. That's really how we should be thinking about, or I would suggest that's how one should be thinking about how dangerous a gun actually is. And for to manage that, typically what people do is they say, well, let's make a law that says you can only have a magazine that has 10 rounds instead of 30 rounds, or let's make a law that says the magazine has to be fixed so I can't quickly swap in another magazine and keep on firing. And all of those are kind of chasing the tail. They're not addressing the problem directly. Really, what you're trying to do is reduce the rate of fire of the gun. So we just make a law that requires a rate limiter. Say if the gun is fired 10 rounds, it has to wait 20 seconds to fire 10 more rounds, or 30 seconds, or whatever time makes sense. Or maybe slow down the rate of fire of the gun. Have a law that says your gun can't fire faster than X. The pro-gun people aren't going to be particularly happy about that, but it's far better than all of these really wonky laws about magazine size and tools to put a magazine on or take a magazine off, etc., etc. So that's another place where having a clearer understanding of what you're trying to regulate and a smarter way to regulate it actually improves things. As a sort of counterexample, there's all of these elements that various legislative bodies are trying to use to describe an assault weapon. They'll say it has a folding stock, it has some sort of foregrip or angled grip or various accessories, and almost none of those has any appreciable um, uh, doesn't change the effectiveness of the gun. In very small ways, yes, but in the ways that really matter, not so much. And including those in the debate, it's not particularly useful. You're not really going after the thing that makes the gun dangerous, which is how big a round it has and how fast it can shoot. Those are the two things that really matter. Oh, so I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Um, there's lots of other things I'd like to talk about, and I'll probably talk about them at one point or another, like gun shows and the mentally ill and IDs and uh, validation, all these other things that kind of tie into the gun debate that are not around the edges, but just didn't have time to get to. And just circle back and say there's a lot of room for some rational change if both sides don't have their heels dug in and firmly try to imagine being in the other side's shoes. And I know that's kind of a platitude, but it's true. And I'm tired of seeing really stupid laws continuously being passed and going into play. And I gotta think if people thought about this just a little bit more, that we'd be so much better off. All right. Thanks for listening.